People who are in favor of this war and think it was a good idea cannot tell a story about how we end up winning.
People who are in favor of this war and think it was a good idea cannot tell a story about how we end up winning. That was not a foreign minister speaking from Tehran. That was not a Russian analyst on state television. That was not even the YouTube viral Professor Jiang Xueqin from Beijing. That was John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, one of the most respected international relations theorists alive on Earth today, the man who literally wrote the textbook on great power politics, the book that every serious strategist at the Pentagon, at the State Department, at every war college in the United States has read, assigned, and cited. And John Mearsheimer, the most credentialed, most mainstream, most establishment-acceptable voice in American foreign policy analysis, sat down with Daniel Davis on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive channel on Day 5 of the U.S.-Iran War, Day 5, and said, there is no coherent strategy, there is no magic solution, there is no story from anybody who is in favor of this war about how we end up winning. Nobody, not one person, not one briefing, not one plan, just an escalation ladder with rungs. And the question of whether there is a magic solution somewhere up there on one of those rungs, there is not. Mearsheimer knows it. And now, by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what happens to the American empire, to the dollar, and to every financial market on Earth when the most credentialed international relations theorist in America says clearly on the record, on camera, to Daniel Davis, we cannot win. Let us be precise about what Mearsheimer actually said, because the financial media is covering this war like it is a military story. It is not a military story. It is a strategic collapse story, and the distinction matters enormously for your money. Mearsheimer described the American strategic process in terms so clinical and so devastating that every word deserves its own paragraph. The Americans moved a massive armada into the region. Trump's team, specifically Steve Witkoff, believed the armada would coerce Iran into capitulating. That was the word Witkoff used. Capitulation. It did not work. So the Americans attacked. They decapitated the Iranian leadership. Mearsheimer called it, quote, clearly a successful decapitation. And it did not work. So the Americans continued to pound Iran, looking for regime change, even though decapitation did not produce regime change. Even though, as Mearsheimer said, Trump's own comments made clear that regime change was not working. So the Americans started searching for other options, fostering insurrection with the Kurds, fostering insurrection with the Azerbaijanis, boots on the ground. Iran were ground troops. The searches for that phrase have been spiking on YouTube for days, and Mearsheimer's answer to all of it is the most devastating three-word phrase in the history of American military analysis. You double down. When you fail, do you double down or do you back off? Mearsheimer's answer, in almost every case, when a major military power takes a step forward and it fails, it doubles down and escalates up the ladder. We are moving up the escalation ladder to find a coherent strategy, not starting with a coherent strategy, not executing a coherent strategy. Moving up the escalation ladder in order to find one. That is the official strategic posture of the most powerful military in the history of human civilization. Hoping that somewhere up the escalation ladder, somewhere between Day 5 and whatever comes after, there is a magic solution. There is not. Mearsheimer knows it. And more importantly, China knows it. Russia knows it. Iran knows it. And the dollar, whose reserve status depends on the credibility of the military power projecting it, is priced as if none of this is happening. That pricing gap between what Mearsheimer is saying and what the dollar is currently worth is the most important trade setup in global macro finance right now. Let me tell you about the Houthis, because Mearsheimer told this story, and it is the most important piece of historical context for understanding exactly where the Iran war goes from here. Last March, not 2015, last March, Trump went to war against the Houthis, a militia, not a nation state, a militia in Yemen, with a GDP that rounds to zero. Trump said, explicitly, that Biden was a pussycat, that Biden had not attacked the Houthis vigorously, that Donald Trump was going to do what Biden could not. The campaign lasted until May, 2 months. 2 months of the most powerful military in human history attacking a militia in Yemen. And in May, Trump backed off, cut a semi-deal, went down the escalation ladder. Mearsheimer said he was, quote, quite amazed that Trump backed off. It's very rare that you see that. The Houthis, the militia with no air force, no navy, no manufacturing base, no GDP worth measuring, were not defeated. Trump understood he could not beat the Houthis, so he stopped. Now, Iran is not the Houthis. Iran has 80,000 Shahed drones in stockpile, 500 more per day off production lines. ballistic missiles hidden in tunnels and firing out of the sand, Mearsheimer's exact description. You don't know where those are. You can't knock those out. Iran has mobile missile systems. Iran has cruise missiles. Iran has the strategic patience of a civilization that has been at war, in one form or another, for 3,000 years. And Mearsheimer's assessment of whether America can exhaust Iran's missile and drone supply. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they have too many missiles, too many drones, too many missiles, too many drones, and they are being strategic about deploying them, preserving the bulk of the inventory for a protracted war of attrition. Iran war unwinnable, the key word that has been exploding in search, is not a political opinion. It is a mathematical assessment from a University of Chicago professor who has spent his career studying exactly this kind of conflict. The Houthis comparison is instructive in one specific way. Trump backed off the Houthis because he recognized he could not win. Will Trump back off Iran? Mearsheimer says, in most cases, when you take a major step and it fails, you double down. The Houthi case was the exception. The Vietnam case was the rule, and we are already on the escalation ladder. Mearsheimer invoked Vietnam twice in the interview, not casually, not as a rhetorical flourish, as a structural template. He remembers when the first U.S. combat forces landed in Vietnam, March 8th, 1965, and then, in his words, we slowly but steadily went up the escalation ladder both in terms of air power and the deployment of ground forces. The belief at every rung of that ladder, we will reach a certain point where we have finally finished off the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. That point never came, and America suffered, his words, a catastrophic defeat. Iran wore no coherent strategy. The phrase that appears in the first 20 seconds of Mearsheimer's interview is the exact same structural condition that characterized American strategic thinking in Vietnam. Not a single rung of the escalation ladder produced the solution. Because the solution was not on the ladder. The solution, if there was one, was not escalating in the first place. The solution was recognizing that the cost of achieving the objective exceeded any strategic benefit the objective could produce. Vietnam cost 58,000 American lives, $2 trillion in current value spending, and it ended with a catastrophic defeat. Iran wore Vietnam comparison. Mearsheimer made it directly. And here is the detail that makes the Iran case structurally more dangerous than Vietnam for American financial stability. Vietnam did not control 20% of global daily oil supply. Vietnam did not have 3 independent mechanisms to collapse the financial architecture of American global power. Vietnam did not have a direct mechanism to trigger the petrodollar's end. Vietnam cost America a decade of stagflation and political humiliation. The Iran war has all of Vietnam's strategic failure characteristics, plus the petrodollar mechanism. Dollar risk 2026 is not a side topic to the military analysis. It is the central consequence of the military analysis, and nobody in mainstream financial media is connecting those two things. Before we get into exactly what this means for the global economy, I want to take a very quick pause. I want you to listen to something very important because I have a specific message directly for you. If you are still watching this breakdown right now, you are officially in a very small and elite minority of people. The vast majority of the internet is completely distracted by short attention spans and meaningless entertainment today. The fact that you have made it this deep into such a complex strategic analysis proves you are entirely ahead of the curve. You possess the rare focus and discipline required to actually understand how the global board is moving before everyone else does. Right now, it is early evening on this Monday, March 9th, 2026. Wherever you are watching this strategic breakdown from today, I would love to know exactly who is in our community. Please drop a quick comment below with your city, your local time, and what the weather looks like outside your window. Reading your comments and seeing our global reach is genuinely one of my favorite parts of creating these deep dives. While you are leaving that comment, please take 1 second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support tells the algorithm that you value serious geopolitical research, and it helps engineered markets grow stronger every single day. I truly appreciate you being here and taking the time to engage with this level of research. Let me know where you are watching from, and let us get right back to the analysis. Let us talk about the phrase that Daniel Davis used in the interview. We have a potential problem with interceptor math. Interceptor math. That is the most financially precise phrase to emerge from any military briefing in decades, and it describes the exact mechanism through which the American empire collapse is being funded in real time. Secretary Hegseth said at the Pentagon briefing, "We can sustain this fight easily for as long as we need to. Iran cannot outlast us." Mearsheimer's response was clinical. When Pete Hegseth is talking about how we can fight this war forever, you really have to scratch your head and say it doesn't sound plausible when you think about the overall strategic situation we're in. It doesn't sound plausible. Here's why. The UAE told Bloomberg they can go about another week at current missile interception rates before running out of interceptors. 1 week. The defensive missiles, THAAD, Patriot are being depleted faster than they can be replaced, because American manufacturing capacity for precision-guided munitions and interceptor missiles was deliberately run down during the unipolar moment. Mearsheimer said it directly. The United States ran down its manufacturing base during the unipolar moment. We don't have the capability to pump out artillery tubes and artillery shells at a rapid pace like we did in World War II. 4 theaters simultaneously. The Western Hemisphere, the Caribbean, Venezuela, Cuba, the Middle East, Iran, the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, Europe's Ukraine, NATO commitments, the possibility of Odessa, East Asia, Taiwan, North Korea, South Korea, 1 industrial base, run down, not rebuilt, trying to supply ammunition for 4 simultaneous theaters. This is not a defense budget problem. This is a manufacturing capacity problem. And manufacturing capacity problems cannot be solved by appropriating more money. You cannot print machine tools. You cannot appropriate a skilled workforce overnight. You cannot legislate a defense industrial base that was outsourced to China over 30 years. Mearsheimer's frame: we're in a situation where we have to prepare for conflict in East Asia. We're deeply involved in the Ukraine war. We're fighting a major war in the Middle East. And furthermore, Trump is interested in old-fashioned colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. 4 theaters, 1 depleted industrial base, 0 magic solutions on the escalation ladder. Us overextension Iran war, the key word, is the polite academic term for what Mearsheimer just described. The financial translation: the United States is spending money. It is printing on a war it cannot win with weapons. It cannot replace fast enough in a strategic environment it did not design for. The dollar is the instrument being used to pay for all of this. And the petrodollar, the architecture that makes the dollar worth printing, is the thing being destroyed by the consequences of the spending. Here's the part that Mearsheimer said clearly, and that the US financial media has been almost completely silent about. What does China do while America is pinned down in Iran? Mearsheimer's answer: this is manna from heaven for the Chinese. If you're the Chinese and you're thinking about capturing Taiwan with military force, really all you have to do is wait a year or so if this war lasts that long, and you'll be in much better shape vis-a-vis the Taiwan scenario than you are today. Manna from heaven. The United States, in Mearsheimer's framework, has spent its precision-guided munition stockpiles, depleted its interceptor inventory, exhausted its navy, tied down its air assets, and exposed the limits of its manufacturing capacity, all while China watches, builds its blue water navy, strengthens its position in the Pacific, and waits for the optimal window to execute on Taiwan. That window is opening, and it is opening because the American strategic establishment, despite having the most expensive military in history, the most credentialed foreign policy apparatus in the world, went into the Iran war without a coherent strategy, without a path to victory, without a story about how we end up winning. Mearsheimer's assessment of China's strategic calculus: not only will the Chinese be able to project more military power into the Gulf over time, but their presence and their interest in the Persian Gulf will only increase with time. The Persian Gulf. The same Persian Gulf that contains the Strait of Hormuz, the same strait through which 20% of global daily oil supply flows, the same oil supply that is currently shut down while America fights a war it cannot win. China secures the Gulf. China secures the strait. China controls the oil supply of Japan, South Korea, India, Pakistan, the entire Asian economic complex. And when China controls that oil supply, when the GCC states begin making arrangements with Beijing rather than Washington, the petrodollar loses its anchor, not in a dramatic overnight collapse, in a gradual structural repricing of the dollar's role in global trade that takes a decade to complete, but is absolutely irreversible once it begins. Mearsheimer: China, Russia, Iran, the 3-player game that determines who inherits the geopolitical order that American imperial overextension is vacating. China and Russia have no interest in the United States winning this war. Mearsheimer said it with precision. They have a deep-seated interest in seeing Iran win the war, and they'll do everything feasible to make sure that happens. Everything feasible. Not moral support, not diplomatic statements. Everything feasible. Intelligence sharing, military technology, economic support, alternative payment systems. Everything necessary to keep Iran intact while America exhausts itself on the escalation ladder. The New World Order 2026 that Jiang Xueqin predicted, and that Mearsheimer's analysis confirms, is not being built at a summit table. It is being built in the exhaust fumes of American military overextension in a war that nobody in favor of it can explain how we win. Interceptor math is a military concept. Reserve currency math is the financial translation of the same mechanism at geopolitical scale. Here is how they connect. Every interceptor missile America fires at an Iranian drone costs $1 to $3 million. Every Iranian drone costs $35,000 to $50,000. The exchange ratio, 60 to 1. Running at 500 Iranian drones per day, every day, for 4 to 5 weeks minimum, Trump's own estimate. That is the visible financial drain. the one in the defense budget, the one that gets measured in congressional appropriations. Here's the invisible financial drain, the one in the dollar's reserve status. The dollar is worth holding as a global reserve asset because of three interlocking structural facts. One, the GCC sells oil in dollars, creating permanent global demand for dollar acquisition. Two, the United States military protects the GCC, making the dollar pricing arrangement durable and enforceable. Three, no alternative settlement mechanism exists at global scale with sufficient liquidity to replace the dollar. All three of those structural facts are being simultaneously challenged by this war. The GCC oil revenues have collapsed because the strait is closed. The petrodollar inflow has stopped. The United States military is demonstrating, one Iranian drone at a time, one depleted interceptor stockpile at a time, that it cannot protect the GCC infrastructure against a determined, well-equipped, asymmetrically fighting adversary. And Bitcoin, with 99.98% uptime, no administrator, no choke point, no nation state that can destroy it, is the alternative settlement mechanism that is already being used by sanctioned economies to conduct international trade outside the reach of American financial coercion. Petrodollar collapse Iran, the keyword, is what happens when all three structural facts supporting dollar reserve status are degraded simultaneously, not destroyed in a single dramatic moment, degraded slowly, measurably, irreversibly. Debasement dollar 2026, the keyword that captures the financial anxiety of people who cannot yet articulate what they sense is happening, is the arithmetic output of defense spending funded by money printing, multiplied by petrodollar revenue collapse, divided by a manufacturing base that can no longer produce weapons fast enough to sustain the military presence that makes the petrodollar arrangement credible. Mearsheimer did not say these words in his interview. He said something that implies them. He said, "You want to remember that this is all taking place in the context of a situation where we ran down the industrial base. We ran down the industrial base that produces the weapons that project the military power that makes the dollar the world's reserve currency. That is the Mearsheimer dollar risk Iran equation. And it is more precise than anything the Federal Reserve has published in the last 12 months. Mearsheimer introduced a concept in his interview that every financial analyst covering this war should have immediately flagged as the most critical variable in the global risk calculation. He called it the Goddard-Damarang moment. His description: if you think you're going down, if you think the country's going to be destroyed, you want to take everybody down with you and you want to have missiles that can do that. You want to maintain a robust missile force in reserve, just in case that moment comes where you think your survival is truly at risk. Iran is not using its full missile arsenal. Iran is being strategic. Iran is preserving the bulk of its inventory, not because it is running low, but because the Goddard-Damarang moment requires a full reserve. Now, let us apply that concept to the oil market. Current situation. The Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed. Oil at $119. Goldman Sachs projecting $150 by end of March. That is the passive disruption, the consequence of the war's existence without Iran activating its full offensive capability against Gulf oil infrastructure. The Abqaiq processing facility, 7% of global daily supply, has not been destroyed. The Ras Tanura export terminal, the largest offshore oil loading facility on Earth, has not been destroyed. The desalination plants across the GCC, the ones that provide 60% of fresh water to civilizations that would physically collapse without them, have been struck to demonstrate capability, not to destroy. Iran is holding. Iran is preserving. Iran is signaling. The Goddard-Damarang moment, the moment when Iran calculates that its survival is truly at risk, is the moment the passive disruption becomes active destruction of every oil and water infrastructure node in the Arabian Peninsula simultaneously. What does oil do at that moment? Goldman Sachs projected 150 if the strait stays closed. The strait staying closed is the floor, not the ceiling. The ceiling is a scenario that no major investment bank has published a price target for because the number is not a price target. It is a civilizational disruption. Iran war, no magic solution, Mearsheimer's phrase, applied to the oil market means there is no magic price at which the supply disruption resolves if Iran reaches the Goddard-Damarang threshold and decides to take everybody down with it. Gold, silver, Iran war. Real assets, protection war. Bitcoin debasement war. These are not investment themes. They are survival positions in a world where the escalation ladder has a rungs above where we currently are that the financial market has not priced. Let me take a moment, and I say this with great respect for the rich history and culture of France, to address the Charles de Gaulle. Emmanuel Macron announced he has ordered the French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle to head to the Middle East. He deployed Rafale aircraft, air defense systems, and radar in what he described as defending France's agreements with Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE. His words, "We must stand with them." Mearsheimer's response was delivered with the precise, quiet devastation of a man who has spent decades studying exactly this kind of decision. President Macron is not very smart. And then, I assume he's going to put that aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf and take that massive amount of air power and finish off Iran. He's going to do what we couldn't do, he continued. Who cares about a French aircraft carrier, right? He's going to have to park that carrier far away from Iran. Otherwise, the Iranians will sink it to the bottom of the Jolly Roger. The Jolly Roger. Let us contextualize this. The United States moved the USS Abraham Lincoln away from the Persian Gulf because of the risk that an Iranian cruise missile would sink it. The most powerful naval vessel ever constructed. A Nimitz-class supercarrier that costs $13 billion to build and another $7 billion per year to operate, moved away from the Gulf, out of range of Iranian cruise missiles. And Macron is sending the Charles de Gaulle. This is not military analysis. This is imperial theater. The last desperate performance of a European elite that, as Jiang Xueqin said, outsourced all strategic thinking to Washington for 80 years, and now has nothing to offer except the symbolic gesture of a carrier that cannot park within range of Iranian missiles without being sunk. Mearsheimer on Europe's position. Europe is completely hopeless. That is not Jiang. That is not a YouTube channel. That is the most credentialed international relations theorist in America assessing the European strategic position in terms that would not be acceptable to publish in any major European newspaper. The financial implication of European helplessness is straightforward and brutal. Europe imports massive quantities of energy from the Middle East. Qatar shut down LNG production. The Strait is closed. Germany, already having lost cheap Russian energy and access to the Chinese export market, is now also cut off from Middle Eastern energy. The German economic model is dead. The European Union, the world's largest trading bloc, is facing simultaneous energy deprivation, demographic decline, political fragmentation from the right, and a military that is, in Mearsheimer's assessment, incapable of doing anything meaningful about any of the crises confronting it. The New World Order 2026 does not have a significant European component. Europe is not building the new order. Europe is trying to survive the collapse of the old one. This is the structural reality that Mearsheimer laid out in the last section of his interview, and that every person managing money needs to have memorized before they open a brokerage account tomorrow morning. 4 theaters, simultaneously, right now. Theater 1, the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela, Cuba, Colombia, the Caribbean. Trump deployed a naval armada to the Caribbean before the Iran war started. He is still interested, Mearsheimer's words, in old-fashioned colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. Theater 2, the Middle East, Iran, the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, 20% of global daily oil supply. The petrodollar's geographic anchor. Theater 3, Europe, Ukraine, NATO commitments. Europeans buying American weapons and giving them to Ukraine. The weapons are still going to Ukraine even while Iran is happening. Theater 4, East Asia, Taiwan. North Korea threatening South Korea. The South Korean Kospi having its worst single day in history while America is stretched across 3 other theaters. And Mearsheimer's assessment of the industrial base that is supposed to supply all 4 theaters simultaneously. The United States ran down its manufacturing base during the unipolar moment. We don't have the capability to pump out artillery tubes and artillery shells at a rapid pace like we did in World War II. 4 theaters, 1 rundown industrial base. The UAE, America's closest Gulf ally, told Bloomberg they are a week away from running out of interceptors. America is cannibalizing munitions from South Korea, Mearsheimer confirmed this, to supply the Middle East theater, which means the theater where China is watching, the East Asian theater, the Taiwan scenario, the one Mearsheimer called manna from heaven for China, is being stripped of its defensive stockpile to supply a war in Iran that has no coherent strategy, no path to victory, and no story about how we end up winning. Us military options Iran, the keyword searches spike. But the actual answer from Mearsheimer is that the options are deteriorating in proportion to the munitions stockpile being consumed on an escalation ladder that does not have a magic solution at the top. Mearsheimer did not talk about the dollar in his interview. He talked about everything that destroys the dollar without using the word. The industrial base was run down. The military is overextended across 4 theaters. There is no coherent strategy for Iran. The escalation ladder has no magic solution. China is the strategic winner. Russia is waiting for the American quagmire to deepen. Europe is helpless. Let me connect those observations to the dollar. The dollar's reserve status is not a law of physics. It is a geopolitical arrangement, and it rests on one foundation: the credibility of American military power to enforce the petrodollar system. That credibility is being audited in real time by Iran, by China, by Russia, by every government on earth that is watching the most powerful military in history unable to articulate how it wins against an adversary that produces 500 drones per day from hidden production facilities in a mountain fortress that cannot be neutralized from the air. When the auditors reach their conclusion, and they are reaching it right now, the dollar's premium over alternative reserve assets starts to compress. Not overnight, not dramatically, but measurably, irreversibly, structurally. Dollar hegemony end Iran, with the keyword, is the phrase that describes what happens when the military credibility underlying the petrodollar is visibly failing in real time on global television. Stagflation Iran war, the economic condition. Inflation from $119 oil. Recession from the economic damage of extended disruption. No monetary policy escape valve because raising rates to fight inflation accelerates the Treasury yield spike that is already happening as GCC sovereign funds liquidate. The Fed is trapped. Mearsheimer's analysis explains why the trap cannot be escaped, because the trap is not monetary. The trap is strategic, and the strategic trap has no magic solution. Gold, silver, Bitcoin. Not because a YouTube channel says so, because a University of Chicago professor just described in clinical detail every mechanism through which the military credibility underlying the petrodollar is being systematically destroyed by a war that has no coherent strategy, no path to victory, and no story about how we end up winning. Real assets, protection war. Commodities, war hedge, hyperinflation, global 2026. These are not financial thesis statements. They are the output of Mearsheimer's strategic analysis translated into portfolio language.